more efficient. And we won't go into all the physics of it, but that has worked out well with aircraft efficiency. Strange noises in the house. Okay, we'll come back to that later. So we have to have a way to cool off all those horses that are running under the cowling there. This plane has a radiator. Some have water cooled, most are air cooled and oil cooled, and even the fuel cools the engine, which we'll talk about more in the future. So let's walk through the parts of the airplane now as if we were pre-flighting the airplane to make sure everything looks okay before we go flying. All right, well, let's say we're starting at the front of the aircraft. We'll check the props to make sure there are no nicks on them so that we wouldn't want a fracture to develop in a propeller blade. That could end up in a catastrophic condition. Here we have where the propellers meet in the part that spins around, and that's why it's called the spinner. We have, on a car, it would be called the hood. On an aircraft, it's called the cowling. There are holes at the front to allow air to come in and cool all those horses underneath the cowling. All right, some aircraft have panels that will open up and you can see the engine very clearly, and many do not. When we do a pre-flight, we want to make sure we don't have any creatures anywhere. They can get in there pretty fast. Mice too. So we've got to make sure there's nobody living in the airplane. Some airplanes have a smaller access panels here, and this one is typical to like a Cessna 172. Checking the oil there. Here are some different kinds of engine access points. Here's one where the whole cowling opens up and it's easier to see where you can check the oil and test the fuel and so on. This one has another smaller opening to test the fuel, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the oil. Here's another one where we have an engine access to check the fuel to make sure it doesn't have water or dirt in it from the engine, the lowest part of the engine. Excuse me. All right, moving on. Underneath the propeller is our front main here, and we'll check and make sure the tire looks okay. We steer the airplane on the ground using the rudder pedals. So we're checking out that front main, and depending on your aircraft, we want to see the distance between the body of the airplane and the wheels assembly. About 4-finger widths depth. If it's too low, that's a caution thing, and if you have a hard landing, it could just smush the whole thing down, and that would be a bad day. So that's why we check that. Some planes, especially the light sports, will have a cast ring. Once again, we control the plane on the ground with the rudder pedals. Okay, some planes have retractable landing gear. Here's a Bonanza that does. And let's look at what we do to check the fuel. Now, why might we want to test the fuel before we go? Well, it can get dirt in it, contaminants from little bits of inside the fuel tanks kind of leaching off, or it could get water in it, bugs. I've seen bugs in it. So different kinds of wings have different ways to drain fuel, so you can check it to make sure it's okay. Let's look at this one. Here we're draining some fuel. The sumps are on the lowest part of the wing, so the water or anything will drain down to that point. And let's look at a fuel sumper here with water in the bottom of it. Notice the fuel for aviation fuel is typically blue for 100 low lead gas, and water is heavier than aviation fuel, so it will sink and it will look kind of like a bubble. Does water burn? No. So you don't want to be feeding your engine water because it might go quiet on you. That's why we sump these engines and fuel tanks to make sure there is nothing like that in there. So we do both the engine and underneath the wings. Now there's some aircraft that have multiple sump points, like the newer Cessnas will have 13 total, so like 5 on each wing. There's marked each one there. Once again, there's an example of sumping out some water. So here's some advice that you may see not only on an FAA written test, but it's a good idea to do it in your actual flying. And that is, after your last flight, fill up the tanks with fuel, because that keeps air out of the tank. Because in North Carolina, the air is moist, and when the temperature cools down at night, water in the atmosphere and in your tank will condense, and then you get water. So we don't want that. And filling up the tanks will prevent it. Let's see. Someone says, I wanted to ask if there will be a pilot flying lesson tomorrow, and if so, what time it will start. Sorry, we're not doing flight instruction. We're just doing ground instruction. But hopefully you can find a flight instructor to help you out with that. Okay. So there is a funny looking pointed thing on the left wing of most aircraft, or something similar to it, and it's called the pitot tube. Notice how it's pronounced, pitot. That's because it's French, and a number of parts of the airplane are French words because the French were instrumental in early design of aircraft. There is a hole at the front of it. It collects air that goes into the system and runs to the airspeed indicator. So we're checking this thing because, oh, dirt dauber got in there or something, and you're going to have 0 airspeed if your pitot tube is closed, and that's not going to be amenable to flying. So we want to check. Okay, the aircraft also has some little holes either on the side of the aircraft or on the pitot tube called the static source, which is the source of ambient air pressure for 3 of the instruments in your panel. And we'll look at that in a future class, but you want to make sure that these are not covered up by a piece of tape or gummed up or what have you, so that your instruments will work correctly. Now on the Piper aircraft, they have a different setup. Excuse me a moment. They have a different setup, so they don't have the pointy pitot tube. They have a mast type pitot. Here's the pitot hole in the front. There's a drain hole in the bottom. And then on the back side, that's where they put their static port. So you just want to check on your Piper aircraft if they have this system to make sure all the holes are open. Righty, let's move on unless there are any questions. Okay, some, but not all, aircraft have a stall warning, which is something that's very good. It tells us if we're getting too slow and the wings are in danger of stalling and not flying anymore. It's not the engine, it's the wings. So some aircraft have a suction type warning device, and how you test it is kind of icky. You have to put a tissue over it and suck on it or something like that, and it will buzz if it's working. Or much more neat is if you have an electric warning device, as long as the electrical system is working on the aircraft, and if it's on, you touch that and it will make a beeping sound, and it will react when your wings are getting close to a stall. But like I say, not all aircraft have stall warnings. Okay, so let's move on with our pre-flight. Our fuel tanks will have a tank cap, usually on the top of the wing. Some of them will have a vent like this at the top. You want to make sure it's not clogged up. They may also have what's called a tab inside the fuel tank. Not all aircraft have this, but if you do, you'll see the little tab down there. When your fuel is up to that tab level, then you'll know that you have whatever amount of fuel your pilot operating handbook says you have when you've got fuel up to the tab, like 20 gallons or something. So that's handy for that. Other aircraft will have a fuel vent line that looks like that. Have you ever had a drink played with your straw in your drink, and you put your straw in there and you put your finger at the top and you pull your straw out and your drink is still up in your straw? Well, most of us have. You can imagine it anyway. So how this works is the tank has to have an air source to let the fuel drain down into the post into the engine. And if its vent is closed, just like putting your finger on the top of your straw, the fuel's not going to get in your engine and things might get kind of quiet. So that's why we check the fuel vent line. Okay, moving on. Airplanes with an electrical system usually have lights in them. They are required in certain circumstances. So on the